Welcome again, everyone, to the next CamAPS FX webinar. Please, can I ask the cameras stay off and your mics stay on mute for the duration? Do ask your questions via chat and be aware that we are recording today's webinar and it will be hosted on the CamAPS online training platform so that you can watch it at a later stage. We have a wide panel today joining us. So Sarah and Julia have joined us before, but I'm very delighted to have Vicky and David with us. We will introduce them as it comes to their slides. I'm doing my usual MC role, and we also have a number of our CamAPS users who will be joining and sharing their experiences with us. And again, we will introduce them as they come along. So I would like to hand over to Julia today to take us through the webinar. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Candice. So thanks everyone so much for joining us, and of course particular thanks to the people with diabetes who've joined us this evening and who have also recorded some videos for us to share with you. So huge thanks to them. So today's webinar is about CamAPS FX closed loop and quality of life. So perhaps slightly less tutorial based than some of the previous webinars. And some of you might be wondering, well, quality of life, what is that about? So what we're going to be going through today really is type 1 diabetes and its impact on quality of life. So what's it like for people with type 1, both adults, adolescents, younger children, and of course also parents or family members, when someone has type 1 diabetes, and how does it impact their life day to day? And quality of life can mean anything from sort of sleep to how it affects your work, to social relationships, to what you're able to do, all of these things. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about how to improve time in range and HbA1c, and of course all those things are really important and a big reason of why there's been a big push for improved technology and closed loop systems in type 1 diabetes. But I think quality of life is perhaps the most important, at least to the people with diabetes. And so a really, really important aspect to discuss and to see how using a closed loop system changes quality of life for people with type 1. So we'll be talking first about what it's like with type 1, and then how using CamAPS FX as a closed loop system impacts quality of life. And we've got sort of a mix of some people who professionally look at quality of life in diabetes, and then of course the people with diabetes and their lived experience. So I think you know Gemma better than me, Candice, so I'll perhaps let you introduce her.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to introduce Gemma. Gemma is a busy mum of 4 kids, and she's going to introduce the aspects of how living with type 1 diabetes in the family can affect both from a parental side of things, but also the wider family dynamics. So I'm going to just play this video for you.
So my name is Gemma, and my son Louis, he was diagnosed when he was 3. He's now he'll be 50 in September. So we've been just over 10 years now living with diabetes. During that time, obviously, we started on the multiple daily injections, and we progressed to various different pumps, sensors, and now we were very fortunate to have the trial on the CamAPS system. And I have to say, it's absolutely changed our lives, not just for him and his flexibility around life, but as a family. I think we have 3 other children, so life, as you can probably imagine, is fairly busy and hectic. But I think it's taken away some of that intense burden of everything was always around him, but around his diabetes. And I think we've definitely built in a lot more flexibility. And I think for us as parents, maybe not so much for him, but I think that worry, all that. So my name is Gemma, and my son Louis, he was diagnosed when he was 3. He's now he'll be 50 in September. So we've been just over 10 years now living with diabetes. During that time, obviously, we started on the multiple daily injections, and we progressed to various different pumps, sensors, and now we were very fortunate to have the trial on the CamAPS system. And I have to say, it's absolutely changed our lives, not just for him and his flexibility around life, but as a family. I think we have 3 other children, so life, as you can probably imagine, is fairly busy and hectic. But I think it's taken away some of that intense burden of always, everything was always around him, but around his diabetes. And I think we've definitely built in a lot more flexibility. And I think for us as parents, maybe not so much for him, but I think that worry or that anxiety of the long-term complications, to see that actually we're getting a really, good for us HbA1c, the best we've ever had. And I think it's how we've achieved that for us that's so positive. We've achieved it without him being in the 20s and being in the 2s. It's a really good, the average is excellent, and it's about, for him, the quality of life. He's very, very active. He plays for a local football team, so training, and quite often it doesn't sort of fit in the ideal timings, before meals and things like that, of an evening and at the weekend. But I think with this system, we are still learning, and I say there's still some management. I'd say we still do put quite a bit of work in, but I think that's just more tweaking the system. We've just, after speaking recently, we've sort of slightly different. We did try taking the pump off, but we had one incident at school when it didn't get reconnected. So obviously that's kind of made us a little bit nervous. And we obviously do use the ease off function, but particularly when he wants to be, just quite sporadic and on the spur of the moment, he decides to go out and kick a ball around. Obviously that ease off and the planning, whilst we plan as much as we can, there are certain times when, for example, I think on last Friday, he came home and said, I'm going for a bike ride. And you kind of think, gosh, that's not planned, that's not part of our programme. But we're learning ways to deal with that, because it is normal that he does that, and we want him to do those things. So one of the things we've been trying is actually taking him out of auto mode, and being able to put a stronger temporary basal, so reducing more of the background insulin, which so far does seem to be working quite well. Obviously, it is a very different setup to what we had previously, where we're not carb loading and we're sort of drizzling in, glucose type drinks when he's playing football. And I think it's just a case of working that balance. And some days it works brilliantly, and other days he quite often goes a bit he's overdone it slightly, But it's a balancing act, isn't it? But I think the difference is he's now never having to come off during a match, during training, and having to stop, which for him just makes him really normal. So that for us is a massive positive. With regards to when he's at school, he does actually have one-to-one support at work, whereas previously he's been so jolly difficult to keep in range, to keep safe. He's very sort of sensitive. He still has that one-to-one support, but they've very much been able to step back and allow him to be more independent, because obviously they've got the comfort of the graph and looking on Diasend and that remote, and also for us, we can see what's going on, so we're confident and happy knowing that he's safe, and it's allowing him to then get on with his work and not constantly being disturbed. So I think for him, as he's getting older, while he was at primary school, actually having someone following him around all the time wasn't really a problem. But of course, becoming 15 is not quite as cool when you've got someone, hovering around you. So I think that has made a big difference, and it makes them happy to know that they can see everything. They have a phone set up, so they're quite happy, and I think it's just reassuring them. So that's certainly very, very positive. With regards to sleep, we've probably had more sleep in the last year than we've ever had in the last 10 years. So that's assuming everything's equal and everything, there's not any issues with the technical side, which actually is very, very rare that we do have an issue. He may sometimes get a bit of a blocked cannula, which will happen from time to time. But all things being equal, we're generally having excellent night's sleep. So and we're finding that the control at night is particularly good, very, very stable and flat. So we sort of figure that, it gives him a little bit more flexibility in the day, because if we've got a good 10, 12 hours of kind of perfect bloods, it then allows him to be, not to be reckless, but to do that sport when it's not quite planned, because it will, and we feel sort of that he's safe to do that. I think, is there any negatives? The only negative for him is that one day will it ever become on an iPhone? That's his only negative. It's the only thing he ever asked me to ask. He will be absolutely highly delighted, hopefully, if that day comes. The only little things around, being for him with the pre-bolusing with food. Sometimes at school it's fine because he's on packed lunches and everything's worked out. But because we do cook fresh from scratch, I still weigh, you know, the carbohydrates, and quite often to get to know what that weight, generally we do that as I'm serving out tea, because as I say, there's 6 of us. So it is sometimes quite tricky to do that 15 minutes before he can eat. Little ways, I mean, obviously, if it's a meal we have on a fairly regular basis, I've got a good idea how much that is. And sometimes if it's a new recipe, for example, I will just say, well, look, let's put in 50 before, and then we'll, as we serve up, we'll work out the difference, you know, and then we'll sort of put the rest in. So it's not 100% ideal, but of course, we don't, you have to be, it's about just being flexible and finding what you know, what works for us. And one of the very new updates, I know, with the add meal function, when for something that's sort of more slow release, that is working fabulously, because we have always struggled with pasta and having to come out of auto mode to go into do an extended bolus, and you know, it's sort of a bit of a 50-50. Sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it just goes horribly wrong. We've always struggled with that, so that seems to be working particularly well. So again, we're just sort of experimenting with different foods and feeling a little bit brave and trying different things, but I know that is quite a new feature. But as I say, all in all, we couldn't really be happier. It's really is life-changing. As a family, I think what I think it's done for us is it's diluted diabetes, where it was very much everything was, oh, have you done this? Have you done that? You know, constantly checking, what's your blood doing now? Better do another test. And I think it's taken all of that. It's just diluted the situation for the family. So I think from, you know, all in all, it's extremely positive.
Thank you very much, Gemma. So I'm going to hand back over to Julia.
Thanks, Candice. And yeah, that was a brilliant video from Gemma. And I'm sure our next speaker can delve a bit more into the broader experience of parents of children and adolescents with type 1. So we have Vicky Matthews, who's a clinical psychologist and worked intensively with children and adolescents, and also the parents with type 1 diabetes. And she previously worked with me in Edinburgh and Cambridge, but is now back in Ireland.
Perfect. Thank you, Julia. So yeah, as Julia said, I worked with the whole family of in a diabetes kind of system, I suppose. So got really good insight into the various difficulties that come with living with type 1 diabetes. And it, you know, will come as no surprise to say it's not just the individual with diabetes who experiences the burden of diabetes, it's everyone around them often as well. And you know, diabetes can impact the quality of life in pretty much any way that you can think of, kind of a physical impact, mental, emotional, psychological, and it can work the other way around as well. So a kind of a reduced quality of life can impact your diabetes control. So it's actually a really important aspect of diabetes care, is to make sure that your quality of life is as kind of taken care of as well as it can be, which is why psychology is often embedded in diabetes teams. And the kind of the impact of type 1 diabetes begins pre-diagnosis, really. And I suppose it's worth saying that this is just headlines. I could talk about this for hours, so I'll just try and give a very brief headline of some of the things that we've come across. But again, even prior to diagnosis, you have that period of illness, of for some people becoming very acutely unwell, maybe a hospital admission, the fear of receiving the diagnosis, the trauma of the diagnosis, the grief with the sudden change of everything you had planned for the future, either as an individual, as a parent, as a family, that feeling of life will never be the same again. Guilt features very, very strongly for parents, oftentimes thinking, you know, was there something I did that was involved in this? And as well, the learning, the tremendous amount of learning that happens in those first few days, the first few weeks, the first few months, probably ongoing, you know, forever. People say that they never stop learning about their diabetes, they never stop learning how to manage it. And following that initial kind of diagnosis period, there's a period of settling back into life and having to explain to others about diabetes and what that means, and dealing with social misconceptions. And this can be really challenging for people. You know, we particularly see it kind of around teenagers, where maybe people start saying, oh, if you have diabetes, does that mean you eat too much sugar or you're really fat? And they don't understand the difference between kind of type 1 and type 2, or you know, we've had people say that they feel really self-conscious about injections and the associations that other people might quite cruelly make about somebody who's carrying around a bag of needles and syringes. And it sets you apart, you know, it makes you a bit different, and having to be a bit different is very, very challenging for people. And then the changes in your routine, the changes in your structure, all of this kind of adjustment is very hard for people to come to terms with, and can have a real impact on quality of life. So after all of that, you know, if we kind of get through the adjustment period, we've got setbacks. You know, again, bullying in school, bullying in social circle, things like that. Avoidance of diabetes care, that's often associated with that kind of the burden of diabetes, but also the feeling different. You know, if I feel different, I can deal with that by just maybe not doing my diabetes care in school or in work or whatever. Or it's just too much for me, I can't manage it right now. Family conflict and expectations, and again, that's that kind of wider system, and we see that really frequently when parents have an expectation of their children managing their diabetes in a certain way. The children aren't doing it in the way that the parents think that they should, and there's real conflict there. There can also be kind of expectations and you know, kind of perfectionism, I suppose, about what levels you'll achieve, time and range, how that should look. And that's often very, very hard to meet. And it's kind of a thing of diminishing returns. You know, the more effort you put in it's not a linear relationship to the outcome that you get. Burnout and lack of motivation, again, is related to that, just kind of the burden of diabetes care. And also unhelpful relationships with food, because you spend so much time thinking about what you're eating. Can I have this? What's this going to do to me? How many carbs are in this? It can lead to quite an unhelpful relationship developing with food, where maybe people try to avoid carbohydrates or don't take the right amount of insulin for various different reasons. And then managing transitions and new situations with diabetes is just an extra layer of complexity, I suppose. We think about transitions, particularly with younger people, maybe transitioning from primary to secondary school, or from kind of second level education into adulthood, whether that be employment or work. You know, those are big transition points that can be very hard to manage. So again, the burden of diabetes, and it's just a general impact on quality of life. It's the never-ending demands of diabetes care. You know, the eating carefully, the exercising, having to think about the impact of that, having to constantly monitor your blood glucose levels, scheduling, planning. Can I do this? It's kind of like what Gemma was talking about, how everything tends to revolve around the diabetes, even in the wider family system. And then the impact of this on independence and autonomy, and, you know, teenagers in particular wanting to test the boundaries and have a bit more independence and autonomy, and parents not being comfortable letting them have that because they haven't kind of demonstrated that they're taking the diabetes care that seriously. And then something even as simple as clothing choices, having to choose something that allows you to do your diabetes care, whether that's something, you know, that allows you access to the appropriate points for injection or somewhere to put a pump. You know, all of these things can really impact on quality of life. And just, I wanted to kind of briefly mention that there was actually a specific measure developed after interviewing a lot of people with type 1 diabetes, to see what were the core areas of which the diabetes related distress tends to present itself. And that's a scale called the diabetes distress scale. And the 4 areas were the emotional burden of living with diabetes, physician-related distress, which is when people don't feel that their doctor understands what they're telling them, or is a bit overly prescriptive with the insulin regime, that kind of thing. Regimen-related distress, which is the kind of, I suppose, the burden of the actual diabetes care in itself. And then diabetes-related interpersonal distress, so how you relate to others when diabetes is a factor. And then finally, some of the kind of mental health challenges that we see as a result of kind of living with diabetes, you know, or that can be quite commonly comorbid with diabetes, would be depression, general anxiety, social anxiety, again, because that fear of, you know, being different, and how to behave in a social setting with diabetes, Health anxiety is a really common one, a fear of complications. So many people who are so very, very afraid of the complications that could come down the line. Even as simple as needle phobias can be a really big challenge for people. A lot around feelings of hopelessness that come with having a chronic illness. Fear of hypos is another common one, where people might end up running themselves a little high to avoid a hypo. Disordered eating, again, from that kind of unhelpful relationship with food. Trauma from the diagnosis, and again, those adjustment difficulties that I was talking about at the beginning. So a huge range of ways that diabetes can kind of impact on your well-being and your quality of life.
Thanks. Thank you, Vicky. That was really helpful. Just a quick comment. If anybody is having any of these issues, what's the best way to go about, trying to manage them or seek help?
So wherever possible, I would speak to your diabetes team. They may very likely have supports available. Certainly in kind of a pediatric setting, there would be supports available for the whole family. But speak to your team, ask them for their recommendations about how they can help and how they can perhaps direct you to appropriate helps if they can't, to appropriate supports if they can't help you directly. Thanks,
Vicky. I really appreciate that. So now, before we go on to the next session with David, we're just going to introduce Ewan, which is a young man who has been using the system, and his sort of input around being a teenager and living with type 1 on the closed loop system.
Hi, I'm Ewan. I've been part of the cloud study at Cambridge for the last couple of years now. Following on from my diagnosis with type 1 diabetes in, I think it was June of 2017. A few days after I was diagnosed with diabetes, I was approached by the clinic team to ask if I wanted to take part in the study. After a few days of talking it through, it seemed like a no-brainer from the things they were offering and the long-term solutions. So I started on the cloud study, I think it was July of 2017, and that was with a remote device and a different pump system to the one I'm on now. I used that device and pump for 2 years. I enjoyed it. I found it was a lot, from the few weeks compared to the few weeks where I was using injections, it was a lot more accessible and easier to use. I preferred doing boluses remotely rather than injecting myself. And in terms of the actual closed loop system, I found that my blood sugars, especially overnight, were much better when I had a closed loop system working in the background to monitor what my blood sugar levels were, and then accordingly adjusting basal rates based on that. At the end of the 2 years, I moved on to a different cloud system, but with the same kind of principles. This one was on a smartphone, which I could use. It was in the format of an app. An app obviously helps it with accessibility, not having to use two different devices, obviously my normal smartphone and then a cloud device. Having it all in one place is much more helpful. In terms of sport, I've really found that having a closed loop system is very beneficial. I can slightly reduce the basal leading up to the sporting activity and then take off the pump when I play a sport. Whereas compared to when I was in injections, I would do a basal set at the start of the day and it would be continuous. There'd be no way I could change it for certain events when I was doing it. It was very, it was less, adjustable. And that's kind of all the benefits around really the cloud are to do with how kind of adjustable it is to your life and not your life having to be shaped by it. It's been something that I've come to rely upon, and I think it's for anyone who's considering whether if they get the chance to use the cloud system, they should definitely take that opportunity, because it just gives you a lot better quality of life, and as well as making sure that you're staying obviously safe and healthy in the longer term and the shorter term. Thank you. Hi, I'm Ewan.
Hi there, I'm David from Edinburgh, and I'm going to really follow on from where Ewan was there. He's obviously a participant in the cloud study, and I'm going to talk about a qualitative piece of work that we did involving several of the newly diagnosed young people who took part in cloud. And I'm going to be speaking about I spoke with 18 young people. They had a mean age of 14 years, and they've been using the CamAPS system for about 6 months by the time I came to speak to them. They were taking part in cloud trial, and they were recruited from 6 different sites. And obviously, as Ewan pointed out, that trial investigated the effects of moving adolescents onto a closed loop following diagnosis. So our study, everyone in the study actually talked about the quality of life benefits that they'd experienced using CamAPS. All of the young people that I spoke to described how the system involved much less work to manage their diabetes. And there were several reasons for that. And one of the main ones was that the sensor was so accurate, they of course no longer needed to do finger pricks. But because the CamAPS app was so useful, they also found that was great to check their glucose levels and administer insulin. It was really easy to use, as Ewan pointed out. So everyone described also feeling much more normal. Rather than having to dig around in their clothing for their pump, as Ewan had described having to use the previous system he'd used, using the app meant that they could check their glucose levels and administer their insulin effortlessly. So this young person described how you can do boluses on the go. So say you're walking in town or something, you can look through the app data there, and instead of having to sit down and take the pump out, and I think it's a lot more suited to maybe modern lifestyle. Using an app on a high-spec smartphone also meant that diabetes tasks could be performed very discreetly in public settings. And again, this helped normalize things for the young people who were taking part. Other people simply thought they were checking the time or composing a text when they were actually doing a diabetes task. So this participant described how, I used to have to take my pump out and obviously you could see it, whereas now it only looks like I'm on my phone playing a game or something. It doesn't make as big a deal of it, you know, if I'm out in public or something. So using the app to check their glucose levels also meant that young people felt much less shackled by diabetes because they no longer needed to carry blood glucose monitors, and they also didn't get nagged by their parents to perform blood glucose checks either. Many of the young people I spoke to reported getting on much better with their parents because using the Diasend app, they could remotely monitor their data rather than having to pester the young person for this information. So as this young person reported, it's just easier on their phone, that's parents having access to the data. So they're not always asking about, let me see your phone, let me just check this for a minute. Young people also describe being much better able to control glucose levels using boost and ease off features on the CamAPS system. And this also had benefits for their quality of life. So boost, for example, could be used for unexpected highs when they felt unwell, or as participant 13 here reported, to better manage high carb meals.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're okay. So he said, if I know what I'm eating, like a high carb meal, and I'm going to go high after it, no matter what I take, I can put boost on for it, like eating pasta, chips, or bread. And with boost on, it'll increase the temp basal, and that's very helpful. And others, and Ewan seems to be one of them there, he'd mentioned about exercise. Other young people describe feeling much less worried about developing hypoglycemia when they use the ease off function during physical activity. So as this young person says, as if I was doing PE at school, then I kept having to worry about going low and things like that. That sometimes happens when I'm doing quite intensive sports. But if I was to have eased off before doing physical activity, then I just wouldn't worry about them hypos so much. Am I on the right slide?
Sorry.
Another quality of life benefit came from the customizable alarms that are part of the system as well. So participants really like being able to tailor their alarms and not also receiving calibration alerts. And as the first quote explains, they got a lot of better sleep because of that. So the participant described how this system only gives you alarms if you really need them. So it's definitely better for their sleep. Others described how being able to choose which alarms sounded helped them help limit the risk of being singled out or stigmatized at school. And as this young person indicated, in school, I keep my phone alarms on vibrate. Only I can hear it because it's on my chair. So it's a lot less of, it doesn't make a scene or anything, and it makes it better because nobody actually knows. Several young people also described how being able to customize their alarms or tailor them resulted them actually responding more appropriately to those ones that they'd retained. So as this young person described, I've turned off the alarms for going high because it kept going off when I felt I had it under control, when I didn't feel like I needed to be reminded. It sort of meant I'd hear an alarm and then not really react. Whereas because I've turned it off, if I hear an alarm now, I know it's because I'm considerably low, so it's something that I need to check out. Before I finish the findings though, just wanted to mention some unintended consequences which young people had identified. So as many participants noted, as well as reducing many of the burdens of diabetes management, using the CamAPS system also meant they spent less time thinking about diabetes. And this maybe goes back to what Gemma talked about as well. However, as a few pointed out, thinking less about diabetes could also result in them forgetting to carry out some key diabetes tasks, such as bolusing for a meal. So it's almost too easy. So maybe your focus isn't there, this participant said. I might sometimes just forget to put in the bolus. I don't do it particularly often, but I do it sometimes. Sometimes if I'm tired, I will. So just to quickly summarize, adolescents in our study described how the CamAPS system lessened a lot of the burdens of managing diabetes. It helped to normalize their lives, and it improved and made it easier for them to get on with their parents. Using the app also made it easy to monitor and review their glucose levels and administer insulin, and functions like boost and ease off help them better manage high and low glucose levels simply because they could issue instructions to the system. Being able to customize alarms also helped limit unwanted attention from others in public settings, and it meant they were more likely to respond to alarms they'd chosen to keep. But because the system was so effective, a few individuals neglected or simply sometimes forgot to perform key diabetes tasks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was really helpful to see that you know, the research backs up what we're hearing from people saying to us from using the system. I want to introduce Les now. Les has had long-standing diabetes and is relatively new to the CamAPS system, only a week on the system, and he has a long history of being involved with diabetes, managing his diabetes and using DIY.
Hi, I'm Les Watson. I've had type 1 diabetes for over 40 years now. I've been an insulin pump user for over 20 years. I've tried all sorts of different pumps, I have to say, and I'm a Dana RS user now, and I love my little Dana. I think it's brilliant. I've also got celiac disease, and it's just, you know, the baggage that comes with you when you've got diabetes. There's a heck of a mental load, and actually over a long period, that load just seems to get worse. For some years, I've looked at numbers of ways of improving my diabetic health, my HbA1c. I've tried exercise, and up until relatively recently, I ran a lot, with not much success at improving my diabetes control, actually. But everybody's different. I then went down the sugar surfing route, did that for a bit, was okay. And then I moved into do-it-yourself pancreas systems. I built Android APS, and I've successfully run Android APS for must be 2.5 years plus. And then the opportunity arose to try CamAPS FX, and I've only been running it for really a very short time, a week or more. But what I've noticed is, out of the box, it just works. And in fact, I'm getting results at least as good as I was getting with Android APS, if not better, without even using any of the other functionality that's within CamAPS, like Boost or Ease Off. And I'm already getting results over 90% time in range. And the other benefit I'm finding with it is the sheer mental load of not, you build this confidence, I think, with a tool that just grows. And one of the benefits of that is you just let it get on with it. So you win your life back in that sense. It's been brilliant. The last week has been brilliant, and I'm sure it'll get better when I learn how to work all the other functionality. That's it, really.
Thanks, Les.
Sorry, Candice, can I just briefly interrupt you? Is that all right? Because there's something that's sort of come up a little bit, and I can see a question in the chat as well that I thought perhaps maybe as a group we could briefly touch on. But I think both Ewan and Les really nicely sort of said you get your life back, and Ewan said your life's not being shaped by your diabetes. And I think that really sums it up so nicely what closed loop can do. But I think there's obviously a huge difference between people who perhaps start using closed loop once they've already had lots of experience with their diabetes and a lot of years of burden, I guess, and people who are on it from diagnosis. And I think as we sort of, in a way, of course, we all are like, want people to go on it from diagnosis in future, of course, right? That's the aim. Like, ideally, if they want, nobody should have to go on to MDI and things like that. But I think someone in the chat pointed out, you know, what's it like when the technology then fails, and you know, do people who go on it from diagnosis, they get all the great benefits, of course, but do they sort of know how to manage without? And I think that's perhaps a question that lots of people ask, and I think the research that David was presenting sort of is interesting from that aspect as well, because these children have never not had closed loop, versus, of course, a lot of the other people who we've been hearing from who know what it's like without. So yeah, so I just wondered whether anyone else wanted to comment on any of that.
I think you're absolutely right, Julia. I think that was something that we were kind of a little bit worried about, and I think I agree with you. Hopefully in future we will be in a position where people with newly diagnosed diabetes are able to go straight onto closed loop systems. And I think what we'll have to do is kind of tailor our management and support around that. I think you know, at the beginning of the study, for all those kids that went on straight from diagnosis, they'd obviously had a period of time on injections and learned how to glucose monitor. But because the system is pretty robust and it doesn't fail very often, there is that worry that kind of, you know, have they got the skills to manage if it does? And I think all we can do to try and mitigate those risks is to make sure that we keep on, you know, each clinic appointment, every opportunity, we kind of have those reminders and build in some kind of ongoing training and support around that to make sure that if that does happen, they know kind of what they need to be doing. Kind of, yeah, I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts around that. I'd definitely rather have it that way, though, don't you think? If that's
I
the
agree.
only downside.
I think there's a lot of I agree. There seems to always be a lot of healthcare professional anxiety around that, particularly, I would say, more so than perhaps the people with diabetes. I agree, but I agree with you. I think there's of course also the risk with you know, lots of other treatments we have for diabetes, and you know, whether people are sort of then applying those. So no, I think it's a sort of interesting conundrum, and perhaps will come more to the fore as there's increasing use of these kinds of technologies.
Though, as well, you also got the fact that whenever I spoke to these young people, you didn't get any of the traumatic accounts that people talk about usually of when they're diagnosed and the months afterwards as well. That those sort of things just didn't feature. So yeah, I totally agree. They don't have maybe the skills if something goes wrong with the system. Let's just say it's very rare that would happen, or that you need to take action to ensure that those skills are in place. But at the same time, they didn't have any of the sort of traumas of having to manage diabetes for months and months and months or years before they got the technology.
And wouldn't it be nice if people didn't have to go through that kind of trauma, I think? Because I mean, I don't know, Vicky, if you ever had any experience of people almost having like a sort of, you know, and I think Les touched on that a bit, that sort of weight and how it really can impact people's mental health long term to go through those kinds of traumatic experiences with type 1.
I mean, I suppose it's a really tricky question. You definitely have people who have kind of, would be in a real complex situation if they only knew how to use one or the other, and for some reason couldn't use it. I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head. I've slightly blocked it out perhaps, but I think it's definitely a really interesting question.
I think what's really great, we've heard from more of the slant of children and young people using the system, and then we've also heard from Les, and I'd like to introduce Roger, who is definitely someone that hasn't been on lots of diabetes technology for the whole of his time with diabetes. So Roger is a patient from our clinic in Cambridge, and thanks so much, Roger, for being willing to sort of join us live on the Zoom this evening. We really appreciate your time. And I just wanted to kind of hear from you first up. Can you just share with everyone how long you've had diabetes, and also how long since you've been using the system for?
Well, I've had diabetes for 40 years, and it's my 40th anniversary as such. So of course I've moved from the realms of using glass syringes to all this new kit, which is just transformational. And I started the CamAPS APS stuff when I took up the latest project with you and Dr. Charlotte, which was, I think, in the summer of 2019. And of course, when it came to the conclusion last summer, decided that really, how do I go back to the old system? And really, it is expensive to run, but my wife and I, we both think that it is the better thing to do. And last March, for some unknown reason, I went off my food and coffee. I'm an avid coffee drinker and probably get through about 10 cups a day. And for a few days, I couldn't bear to even take a cup of coffee. And of course, with COVID just being introduced, as it were, my wife was worried one evening and wondered whether I was going into a coma or whatever it was. And of course, all she did was lean over, pick up my phone, put in the code and all the rest of it, and could see what my blood sugar levels were like. And that was huge reassurance for her. And it is transformational, I think. It is unbelievable where we've come to over the past 40 years.
And you said you said a couple of times about sort of specific things that you found really helpful, like eating out is something that you find much easier. And
oh gosh, well, here again, I'm in the days of having a glass syringe, or even when we got to the delights of plastic disposable syringes. Having to take yourself off to the gents to go and have an injection. You go in there and other chaps would come in and give you a rather strange look, thinking you were administering drugs, which of course to some extent you were. And you go through into the business of explaining it's insulin because I'm a diabetic. You'd have to go through all this justification stuff. So of course, to actually have a mobile phone, you sit at the table and just quietly, discreetly put in how many carbs you think you're just about to have, is so much easier. Excuse me, I'm going to put on my battery. So I'm getting low. Yeah, all right, we won't fizzle out anymore. Yeah, so, it's, as I say, the word I use is transformational, because it really, really is. It really improves the quality of your life. I have to say, I've never been one of these people that have actually considered diabetes to be an illness. I've always thought of it as a condition. And that's the way that I approach it. So, you just get on and deal with it as best you can with whatever resources you've got. But I'm going to say all this new CamAPS stuff and all the rest of it, it is unbelievably good. Unbelievably good.
That's great. Thanks, Roger. So kind of particularly, it's given you more flexibility, kind of reassurance, and for your wife as well. I know, I think having the CGM side of it, you mentioned as well to me that your hypo awareness has improved. So although
Yes.
You've still got the alarms.
Yeah. But again, sometimes, well, especially at night time, I'll get a nudge in the back to say, "Did you hear that, Roger?" And I've got an alarm which is set quietly, really. And I say, oh, you know, shouldn't really then deal with it and have a juice or whatever, just to sort it out. But, you know, it's those sorts of things which give the reassurance. And I think to actually get into a situation where you didn't have it, I think I'd be bereft, really. And I would be, I could go back to the old system, but I just wouldn't want to do it. Not with all that goes with it. And, you know, and my fingers are no longer sore. I'm a church organist and this sort of thing. So my fingers are actually quite comfortable these days because I don't have to keep stabbing them every day, 10 times, whatever it was. You know, so there's been huge benefits from this, really.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for sharing those with everyone, Roger. I think if you're happy to stay on, I'm sure we might have there might be some questions after that you can help us to answer, which would be lovely. So I think in summary, hopefully what we've done is address some of the impacts of type 1 diabetes and the impact it has on quality of life, both for individuals that have diabetes and also for the people around them and that's supporting them. And hopefully we've identified some of the ways in which CamAPS FX can improve that side of it and sort of explored the common themes that have come out from various people that we've heard from. And I think kind of the key points that I've sort of taken from it is no one's pretending this is, you know, a sort of plug and play, set and forget it. Everyone, you know, I think Gemma really kind of highlighted nicely, it's still a lot of work. I think, though, what it does do is from the difference between it and some other ways of managing diabetes is it significantly reduces the amount of work that it can take to achieve those targets that you want in terms of glucose, but also the impacts on improvements of quality of life. And, you know, the sort of themes that came out from all of our speakers were around sort of reducing that intense sort of burden, and particularly around being able to manage certain situations like eating out and activity with that sort of increased flexibility and discretion that other systems and ways of managing diabetes don't necessarily provide. And I think that's kind of come through nicely in all the people we've heard from this evening. So thank you for sharing. I don't know whether anyone has any other points, you know, Vicky, David, Janet, Julia, anyone has any other points to kind of pull out of that I've not picked up on, or whether there's any questions from people that, or kind of comments from people really, even if not sort of a question specifically.
I think the only thing, we didn't have anybody sort of younger, and I think another sort of really important factor perhaps, and I think Gemma did mention that, is the independence for children and adolescents, the increased independence, I think, and not being so constantly checked up on. And, you know, a lot of parents of children kind of in the age group 7, 8, 9, 10 that will say, you know, they're able to go on sleepovers now and things like that, you know, like you were saying, Sarah, just being able to sort of take part in the normal activities. So I think that's really another huge benefit, I think, for that particular age group.
Yeah, you can't underestimate the impact that must have, can you, of sort of not being allowed to do the same things that your friends are doing because you have diabetes.
Absolutely. I mean, people will say things like, oh, you know, my child wasn't invited to birthday parties because the other parents felt it was too complicated to deal with diabetes, and it just absolutely breaks your heart.
It does.
Yeah, I suppose actually just to add to that, one of the, you know, things that has come up before is schools not wanting kids to go on school trips and things like that without a parent coming along. You know, there was one situation where it was an overnight trip and the school insisted on the parent coming every night to supervise the insulin. The child was on MDI, and it was, you know, parent and child were saying there's no need for us to do this, but it had a massive impact then on the enjoyment.
Yeah, and even the management in schools. I know lots of children are lucky enough to sort of have one-to-ones, and I know, like Gemma was saying, that her son still has his one-to-one, although they can kind of back off more. We've certainly had situations in a couple of schools that they've got children who they historically had to have a one-to-one sitting in the classroom with them, but actually through having the technology and the ability to view the data remotely and know that there are the alarms and things, that actually the person that was sort of responsible for the child has been able, that perhaps was a sort of a member of staff and had other work to do elsewhere in the school, could actually be in the office, be kind of separate from the child, rather than having to sort of be sat next next to them to keep an eye on them, and still very safely just, you know, keep an eye on what's going on, get involved if there was the need to, but obviously that need is far reduced. So those sorts of impacts as well of, you know, someone having to feel that they're different, that they need to have their sort of person sat by them keeping an eye on them is definitely something we've seen improve.
On the note of burden, there's a question in the chat that sort of ties in with that, because obviously at the moment, like you were sort of saying, Sarah, there's still, it's not really plug and play, you know, you still have to do things and put in your boluses and things. And someone's asked, are there any plans to implement unannounced meals and CamAPS in the near future? Does anyone want to comment?
Oh, we hope so. There's lots of exciting things that we hope will be happening. I think so we're hoping that we might be able to start a trial shortly in looking at using the system, but with faster acting insulin. So there's faster and faster acting insulins coming, becoming available. We've got some now, and there's more coming. And we're hoping that we are going to do a study where we have people using fully closed loop, so no meal bolusing. And like with everything, it will be done in a study first, and in adults initially, and then all the studies that we've done so far, we then do them in children secondly. But yeah, exactly, if we could have, you know, a system where you no longer even had to worry about bolusing, you know, you still got to wear the kit, you still got to, you know, make sure your sets are changed and all those things, but again, that would take another whole massive issue out of the picture. So yeah, that's exactly where we'd like to go.
Yeah, that's the dream, isn't it? And I don't know if you can see the chat, Candace, but there's somebody asking about sort of cost involved in the system, particularly for pumps. If the pump's not funded, I don't know if you can say anything about that.
Yeah, I can't see the actual question.
Candace has disappeared.
Yeah.
She's there. In terms of pump funding, if someone didn't meet criteria for insulin pump funding on the NHS, then there is the opportunity, there is, you know, the ability that you can self-fund a pump and the consumables. It's super expensive to have to do it that way. It probably works out somewhere around, if you average out the 4-year cost of a pump over the life cycle of that pump, it's probably sort of between sort of £1,500 and £2,000 a year, but there's the upfront cost of buying the pump in the first place. I definitely would be talking with your diabetes team, because when you look at the way pumps are given funding, they are for either what's considered suboptimal control, i.e. an HbA1c of above 69 or 8.5%, or fear of disabling hypoglycemia. And I think that's commonly felt that that's sort of, you know, a bit of a catch-all. So I definitely would talk to your centre about supporting you to have pump therapy. But yeah, we do have some people who self-fund, and we obviously have people who self-fund the app that have pump and sensor funding, or have pump funding but have to fund the sensors themselves and fund the app themselves, and it is expensive, which is why all the research that's going on is being done to provide evidence for reimbursement. That's the aim. We, you know, the system's obviously being commercialized, and we do have lots of users who are currently paying for it, as like Roger was saying. That's a choice that, you know, some people are fortunate enough to be able to do that, other people, you know, and have to make sacrifices to do that, and there's people that just would be completely out of reach. And what we want in the future is a system that's you know, closed loop systems available on the NHS for people to use from diagnosis, ideally. And all the research that's ongoing is to facilitate more, is to provide that evidence for reimbursement. And NICE are looking at it again now. All takes time to get these things to work through, but you can be reassured that in the background, people are working very, very hard to try and make sure that this becomes available on the NHS for anyone who might want it.
Absolutely, and I think there's chat as well about quality of life and how that, you know, is nice considering that and that sort of thing. And I don't know, David, if you want to touch on what some more of the work that you were doing up in Edinburgh towards that.
I mean, as far as I know, I think it is factored into decisions made by NICE. That I think the work that we've done with the participants at various of the studies going on at Cambridge and the reporting of that is taken into account. I mean, I don't know what weight it gets, but I do know that I think some of the accounts and NICE also like to hear from individuals who've been using the systems as well. As I said, I'm not sure quite what weight is attached to it, but I certainly think it does play a factor in the decision making in terms of rolling these things out.
See, there's a question here about, you know, what can people do as sort of people living with diabetes to help petition the need for NICE and, you know, to try get the reimbursement through. Does anybody have any comments on what is helpful?
Candice, we're very worried now about the children like Ewan who were in our newly diagnosed study. Quite a few of them are coming up now to the end of 4 years. And that's as much funding as we have for the study. And it looks very likely that some of them won't be able to continue using it. And they've never used another system, so it's really hugely concerning for these kids.
So hopefully, luckily, NICE will deliberate and sort of deliver a verdict in 2022. So that's next year. So we should have some stance to work from, like we had around the pumps in 2008. But what can people living with diabetes who want this technology do to get, you know, more weight behind them? The healthcare professionals are doing evidence and submitting research papers. Is there anything somebody who's living with diabetes or has a child with diabetes can maybe do to help add weight to the case?
I mean, I think, oh, sorry, Sarah.
No, you carry on, you carry on.
No, I think, you know, and I think Janet often says this as well, you know, your voice is the most powerful. You know, I can stand all day and talk about research and patients I see in clinic and things like that, but, you know, you're the ones having to live with it. So I think your account, you know, and as you saw in the videos as well, it's so much more powerful than anything. And I think getting involved with organizations like JDRF or Diabetes UK to either fundraise or get your voice heard, publicized, but also even just in your own clinic, like asking for things, you know, asking, well, why aren't you offering more pumps? Or I've seen this system, is there a way that we can facilitate? You know, I think if you ask for it, then people start having to try and meet some of those needs. That would be my view. I don't know what you think, Janet or Sarah.
I absolutely agree, and I think the Libra is a really good example of that. So there you had a device that had no clinical trials at all. There was no evidence of it, but because people wanted it and they fought hard for it, and they kind of lobbied the right people you know, in their centres, and people via Diabetes UK and JDRF and NHS England, and that was all listened to. And off the back of that, money was ring-fenced to get a certain amount of access to that within the NHS. And again, not as much as we would like. There's still lots of people who don't have access to that, but it was a start. And that was really based on sort of people power, to be honest, because like I said, there was very little, well, there was no at the time evidence that actually it was even kind of beneficial, apart from the fact of, you know, clearly if you don't have to prick your finger, then that's gonna be nicer. So I think definitely kind of talking to people in your clinic, talking to people in those kind of organisations that Julia said, and NHS Diabetes, NHS England, the more people that do that and kind of keep poking and saying this is what we want, because NICE is great. It takes everything that goes through NICE takes a long time, and the speed that technology is changing at the moment, NICE does feel like a kind of sort of bit of an archaic model to be trying to keep up with all this change in technology. I think last time it looked at kind of sensor augmented pumps. By the time they deliberated on everything, the pumps that they were deliberating about had actually been and gone. So yeah, the more you kind of can get involved and sort of lobby those groups, I think it all helps.
No, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm just aware of time. Is there any in the chat, anybody noticed anything burning that they're wanting to cover? I think there's lots of positive about, you know, it's people power is definitely it. So it's reiterating what you've said, Sarah. And then, you know, just trying to find what works for the individual, to make sure that you know, you get that balance of getting the numbers but also the quality of life is sort of the holy grail everyone is trying to achieve. Any last final questions? I can't see anything that I can find on the chat. Anybody else want to make any last comment?
If I may, is that possible? Hi, Roy Johnson here. People have been asking about NICE and how do they get involved in the way forward is that there is a new, as you said, technology forum going on at the moment. And if you look at the people, there are patient representatives on there, and you can send your requests, etc., to those to put your thoughts forward. So that's a way to go for that one, if I may say.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roy. That's really helpful. So please do, you know, share on social media, do lobby your, you know, in your clinic. Diabetes UK and JDRF are great champions of causes as well. So do involve everyone. But thank you very much for attending the webinar tonight. It has been a great sort of look at quality of life and the impact diabetes has on it and vice versa, and how technology can make a huge difference. So thank you very much for your attention tonight, and thank you very much for everyone who participated. It's been a great experience, so thank you and have a good night.